Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most romanticized yet utterly miserable jobs in medieval history, the castle guard. You've probably seen them in movies, standing tall and proud atop stone battlements, armor gleaming in the sunset, ready to defend honor and kingdom with unwavering courage. But trust me, being a real medieval castle guard was nothing like a Hollywood epic. It was cold, brutal, underpaid work that guaranteed you'd spend most of your life wet, hungry, and terrified of being shot full of arrows by people you'd never met. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're born into a peasant family in 12th century England. Your father works the Lord's fields, your mother spins wool, and your future looks about as bright as a torch in a thunderstorm. Then one day, the castle steward comes around looking for able-bodied men. He promises steady meals, a place to sleep, and maybe even a few coins. It sounds like salvation compared to a lifetime of mud and barley porridge. Congratulations. You just signed up for one of the worst jobs in medieval Europe. Chapter 1. Welcome to your new life of misery. You weren't born to be a castle guard. Nobody was. This wasn't a noble calling passed down through generations like blacksmithing or farming. Castle guards were recruited from the desperate, the landless, and the unlucky. Maybe your crops failed 3 years in a row. Maybe your father died and left you with nothing but debts. Maybe you were caught poaching the Lord's deer, and this was your alternative to having your hand chopped off. The recruitment process wasn't exactly rigorous. Can you hold a spear without falling over? Can you see approaching enemies without squinting like a confused owl? Can you climb stairs without having a heart attack? Congratulations, you're hired. No background checks, no training period, no orientation packet explaining your duties. Just a rusty spear, a moth-eaten cloak, and a hearty try not to die on your first week. Your fellow guards weren't exactly the cream of medieval society either. There was old Henrik, who'd been guarding walls for so long he'd forgotten what the outside world looked like. There was young Tom, who was definitely lying about his age and probably hadn't grown his first whisker yet. And there was Mad William, who talked to ravens and claimed they gave him strategic advice. This was your new family. This was your brotherhood in arms. This was the crack team responsible for defending one of the most important military installations in the kingdom. You quickly learned that castle guards fell into several categories. There were the lifers, men who'd been doing this job so long they'd become part of the stonework. They knew every crack in the walls, every weakness in the defenses, and exactly how long it took for hypothermia to set in during a winter night watch. These men had given up hope of any other life and had achieved a kind of Zen-like acceptance of their misery. Then there were the desperate ones, men fleeing debts, crimes, or failed marriages. They saw castle guard duty as a temporary refuge, planning to disappear into the countryside as soon as things cooled down. Most of them never made it past their first winter. There were also the ambitious ones, usually younger men who believed that faithful service might lead to advancement. Maybe they'd catch the Lord's eye during a battle. Maybe they'd be promoted to sergeant-at-arms or even household knight. These poor souls clung to hope like drowning men cling to driftwood, and their dreams usually died about as quickly as their enthusiasm for standing in freezing rain. And finally, there were the completely mad ones. Men who'd seen too much combat, suffered too many head injuries, or simply couldn't cope with normal society. They were often the most effective guards because they genuinely didn't care if they lived or died, which made them unpredictable in combat and absolutely terrifying to enemy scouts. Your housing situation reflected your status in the medieval hierarchy, which is to say, you were barely above livestock. You got a straw mattress in the guard barracks, a space roughly the size of a modern closet that you shared with anywhere from 6 to 12 other men. Privacy was a luxury concept that wouldn't be invented for another few centuries. The barracks smelled like a combination of unwashed bodies, moldy straw, weapon oil, and despair. In winter, you huddled together for warmth like puppies in a basket, except these puppies were armed, often drunk, and had personal hygiene standards that would make a pig wrinkle its snout in disgust. Your possessions fit in a single sack: a spare tunic, maybe a cloak if you were lucky, your eating knife, a wooden cup, and whatever small treasures you'd managed to accumulate. A lucky coin, a letter from home, perhaps a small carving you'd whittled during long night watches. These few items represented your entire material existence. The castle itself became your world, and it was a world with very clear boundaries. The great hall was for nobles, the kitchens were for servants, the stable was for horses, and the walls, towers, and gates were for you. You lived in the liminal spaces, the in-between places where danger lurked but comfort never visited. Chapter 2. The daily grind of medieval security. Your day began before dawn, which in winter meant it began in what felt like the middle of the night. A sergeant would kick your straw mattress and grunt something about your watch duty. There was no gentle wake-up call, no time to collect your thoughts or prepare mentally for the day ahead. You rolled out of your straw, grabbed your spear, and stumbled out into whatever weather the English countryside had decided to throw at you. The morning inspection was a daily humiliation disguised as military procedure. The sergeant would examine your equipment with the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be doing literally anything else. Your spear point was dull? That's a day without ale. Your mail was rusty? That's kitchen duty after your watch. Your attitude was insufficiently martial? That's a week of cleaning the latrines. These inspections weren't really about military readiness. They were about establishing the pecking order and making sure everyone remembered their place in the castle hierarchy. You were a tool, and tools needed to be maintained, but nobody particularly cared about the tool's feelings on the matter. After inspection came the assignment of duties, and this was where you learned that castle defense involved a lot more standing around than anyone had mentioned during recruitment. Gate duty meant checking every person entering or leaving the castle, which sounds simple until you realize that merchants, servants, nobles, clergy, and random travelers all had different rules about who could vouch for them and what documentation they needed. Wall patrol meant walking the same circuit hundreds of times per week, scanning the horizon for threats that probably weren't there, while trying not to think about how easy it would be to accidentally fall off the battlements. Tower watch meant climbing narrow spiral staircases to small, cold rooms where you'd spend hours staring at the countryside and praying that nothing interesting would happen. The weapons you were issued reflected your status as an expendable asset. Your primary weapon was usually a spear or pike, a long wooden shaft with a metal point that required minimal training and could be mass-produced by any competent blacksmith. It was effective in large groups, but fairly useless in individual combat, which told you everything you needed to know about your tactical role. You might also receive a short sword or dagger, though these were often old, poorly maintained weapons that had been passed down through generations of guards. The blade might be nicked, the handle wrapped in fraying leather, and the balance completely wrong for your height and build. But it was steel, and steel was better than nothing. Armor was an even more depressing affair. Full mail hauberks were reserved for knights and sergeants. You got whatever was left over: a padded jacket, maybe a mail coif if you were lucky, and possibly a helmet that didn't quite fit your head. The padding was usually stuffed with whatever material was available: straw, old cloth, or hair from various animals, and it smelled like it had been worn by every guard who'd served before you. Your shield, if you got one, was typically a simple wooden affair covered in leather and painted with the Lord's colors. It was heavy, unwieldy, and designed more for formation fighting than individual protection. In a real battle, it would absorb a few blows before splintering apart, at which point you'd be left with a wooden handle and the fervent hope that the enemy would get distracted by someone else. The daily routine was mind-numbing in its repetition. Morning watch, midday meal, afternoon duties, evening watch, sleep, repeat. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years of the same basic pattern. The only variations came from weather, which could make your misery wet, cold, hot, or windy, but never actually reduced the basic level of misery. During quiet periods, which were most of the time, you fought boredom like a personal enemy. Some guards carved wooden figures or played dice games with pebbles. Others told stories, sang songs, or engaged in elaborate practical jokes that often ended with someone falling off something high. The smarter guards learned to read or write, skills that might eventually help them escape their current situation. But mostly, you waited. You waited for your watch to end, for your next meal, for payday, for leave, for something, anything, to break the monotony of standing on stone walls and staring at empty fields. Chapter 3. The Art of Standing Around in Terrible Weather. Medieval England's weather was your constant companion, and it was not a friendly companion. It was more like that drunk uncle who shows up uninvited to family gatherings and makes everyone miserable until he finally passes out. Except this drunk uncle never passed out, never left, and had an infinite supply of rain, wind, and bone-chilling cold. Winter duty was a special kind of torture that medieval castle guards knew intimately. Imagine standing on top of a stone tower for 4 hours in January, wearing wool clothing that was already damp from the previous day's rain, holding a metal spear that conducted cold like it was designed by Satan himself. The wind whipped across the battlements with nothing to slow it down except your increasingly numb face. Your wool cloak, which had seemed warm enough in the barracks, became a sodden, heavy blanket that clung to your shoulders and dripped steadily onto your feet. The leather of your boots cracked in the cold, letting in moisture that would freeze your toes into useless lumps of flesh. Your hands, gripping your spear, would go from cold to numb to completely without feeling, until you couldn't tell if you were still holding your weapon or if it had fallen over the wall an hour ago. The stone walls themselves seemed designed to amplify the cold. During the day, they absorbed what little warmth the weak winter sun provided. At night, they radiated that cold back at you like malevolent ice blocks. Touching the stone with bare skin was like grabbing a red-hot poker, except instead of burning you, it froze you instantly. Rain was perhaps worse than snow, because at least snow was honest about being cold. Rain pretended to be mild and pleasant, until it soaked through every layer of clothing you owned and turned your body into a shivering, miserable sponge. Medieval waterproofing consisted mainly of hope and tightly woven wool, which worked about as well as you'd expect. The rain would start as a light drizzle that seemed harmless enough. Then it would gradually intensify until you were standing in what felt like a waterfall, with streams of water running off your helmet, down your neck, and into places you didn't know water could reach. Your leather armor would start to smell like wet animal, because that's essentially what it was. Summer brought its own special miseries. The same stone walls that froze you in winter now baked you like a loaf of bread. Metal armor and weapons became too hot to touch comfortably. Your padded jacket turned into a personal sauna that trapped every drop of sweat your body could produce. The smell in the barracks during summer was indescribable. Imagine a dozen men who haven't bathed in months, wearing the same clothes every day, living in a small stone room with no ventilation. The sun reflected off the pale stone walls and into your eyes with the intensity of a divine punishment. There were no sunglasses, no cooling systems, no relief except the occasional cloud that would provide a few minutes of blessed shade before moving on to torment someone else. Dehydration was a constant threat during summer watches. The castle well might be a 5-minute walk from your post, but leaving your position without permission could result in punishment ranging from extra duties to outright flogging. So you stood there, slowly cooking in your own sweat, while your tongue turned to leather and your vision started to blur from heat exhaustion. Wind was a year-round menace that seemed to take personal joy in making your life miserable. Castle walls were specifically designed to be tall and exposed, which made them perfect targets for every gust of wind that happened to be wandering through the countryside. A strong wind could literally knock you off the battlements if you weren't careful, and many guards learned to walk with a constant crouch to lower their center of gravity. The wind also carried with it every unpleasant smell within a 5-mile radius. Smoke from the kitchens, stench from the latrines, odors from the stables, and occasionally the sweet, sickly smell of death from battlefields or execution grounds. Your nose became an unwilling chronicle of everything awful happening in your immediate vicinity. During storms, you didn't get to go inside and wait it out like sensible people. Storm duty was when castles were most vulnerable to attack because enemies might use the chaos and reduced visibility to launch surprise assaults. So you stood there in driving rain, with lightning crackling overhead and thunder shaking the stone beneath your feet, trying to watch for threats you couldn't possibly see through the weather. Your equipment suffered right along with you. Leather cracked and rotted in the damp. Metal rusted despite your best efforts to oil and maintain it. Wooden spear shafts warped and split. Cloth fell apart from constant exposure to moisture and temperature changes. You spent almost as much time trying to maintain your gear as you did using it, and you were usually fighting a losing battle. The worst part was that there was no escape. Modern people can go inside when the weather gets bad, adjust thermostats, put on appropriate clothing, or simply avoid going outside at all. Medieval castle guards had to endure whatever nature threw at them for hours at a time, with minimal protection and no alternatives. You learned to read weather patterns like a survival skill. The color of clouds told you how much rain was coming. The direction of the wind predicted temperature changes. The behavior of birds and animals gave you clues about storms approaching. You became a walking barometer, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of pure self-preservation. Chapter 4. The Food Situation. Spoiler, it was terrible. Medieval castle food was designed with one goal in mind: keeping you alive long enough to continue standing on walls and poking people with spears. Flavor, nutrition, and basic human dignity were luxury concepts that had apparently not yet been invented. Your daily meals were a masterclass in culinary depression that would make modern prison food look like fine dining. Breakfast, if you were lucky enough to get one, usually consisted of bread and ale. The bread was dark, dense, and often contained ingredients that weren't technically food. Sawdust was a common additive to stretch the grain further. Small rocks occasionally found their way into the mix, providing exciting opportunities to chip your teeth during what should have been a simple meal. The ale wasn't the rich, flavorful beer you might imagine. It was weak, sour stuff that had been watered down to the point where its main virtue was that it probably wouldn't kill you immediately. Water was often unsafe to drink, so weak ale became the default beverage for all meals. You learned to appreciate the mild buzz it provided, because that slight alcoholic haze was sometimes the only thing that made standing on cold walls bearable. Your main meal of the day was typically a bowl of pottage, which was essentially medieval slop. Imagine taking whatever vegetables were too old to sell, whatever grain was too moldy to make proper bread, and whatever scraps of meat were too gristly for the noble's table, throwing it all into a pot with water, and boiling it until it reached the consistency of thin mud. That was pottage. The meat content of your pottage was theoretical at best. Occasionally, you might find a piece of fat or gristle that had once been part of an animal, but actual muscle meat was reserved for people higher up the food chain. Most of your protein came from whatever insects had died in the grain stores, providing tiny crunches of surprise throughout your meal. Vegetables and pottage were usually turnips, onions, and cabbage that had seen better days. The turnips were often partially frozen, creating interesting textural contrasts between the soft, mushy parts and the hard, icy chunks. Onions added flavor in the same way that hitting yourself with a hammer adds sensation, technically accurate but not particularly pleasant. Bread was your main source of calories, and it reflected your status in the castle hierarchy with depressing accuracy. The lord got white bread made from finely ground wheat flour. Knights and important servants got brown bread made from less refined flour. You got whatever was left over, which was usually a dark, heavy loaf that contained roughly equal parts grain and optimism. Your bread often contained maslin, a mixture of different grains that had been combined not for flavor, but for economy. Wheat, barley, oats, and sometimes peas were ground together into a flour that produced bread with the texture of tree bark and the flavor of disappointment. During lean times, acorns and other non-grain materials were added to bulk up the loaves. Seasonal variations in your diet depended entirely on what was available, and availability was often limited by factors beyond anyone's control. Spring was known as the hunger gap, when last year's stores were running low, but this year's crops weren't ready yet. You lived on increasingly creative combinations of preserved foods and whatever could be foraged from the countryside. Summer brought fresh vegetables and the possibility of meat if animals were slaughtered for preserving. This was the closest thing to good eating you'd experience all year, though good was relative when your standards had been set by months of moldy bread and watery pottage. Autumn was preservation time, when every available hand worked to salt, smoke, dry, and store food for the winter. You might get slightly better meals during this period, as the urgency of the work earned you a few extra scraps from the preparation tables. Winter was survival mode. Salted meat that had been preserved months earlier, root vegetables stored in cold cellars, and bread made from whatever grain remained in the stores. Everything tasted like salt, everything had the texture of leather, and everything reminded you that spring was still months away. Feast days provided brief respites from the culinary monotony, though even then your portion was carefully calculated to reflect your lowly status. While the nobles enjoyed multiple courses of elaborately prepared dishes, you might receive a slightly larger portion of pottage and perhaps a piece of meat that hadn't been completely destroyed by preservation methods. The castle's food stores were constantly under threat from rats, mice, and insects that seemed to have better organizational skills than most human armies. Grain became infested with weevils, which added protein to your diet whether you wanted it or not. Stored meat developed various molds and bacterial films that you learned to scrape off before cooking. Water quality was a constant concern that affected every aspect of food preparation. Wells could become contaminated, streams could carry diseases, and stored water could develop its own ecosystem of microscopic life. Most liquids were boiled or fermented, not for flavor, but to kill whatever might be living in them. Cooking methods were basic and often ineffective at making food safe or palatable. Most of your meals were boiled, because boiling was simple, required minimal fuel, and theoretically killed harmful organisms. The downside was that boiling also removed most of whatever flavor and nutrition the original ingredients might have possessed. You ate with your hands and a personal knife, using pieces of bread as plates and napkins. Communal eating meant sharing bowls, cups, and utensils with men who had personal hygiene standards that would horrify modern health inspectors. Disease spread quickly through the ranks, often starting with contaminated food or shared eating implements. Mealtimes were brief, functional affairs with minimal conversation. You had a limited amount of time to consume your allocated portion before returning to your duties. There was no lingering over food, no savoring of flavors, no social bonding over shared meals. You ate quickly, efficiently, and without complaint, because complaining about food was a luxury you couldn't afford. Chapter 5: The Luxury of Medieval Healthcare. Medieval medicine operated on the revolutionary principle that most illnesses could be cured by either bleeding you until you were too weak to complain, or prescribing treatments that were more dangerous than the original problem. As a castle guard, you had access to the finest medical care that complete ignorance of human anatomy could provide. The castle's medical practitioner might be a trained physician if you were extremely lucky, but more likely was a monk who'd read a few books about herbs, a wise woman who knew traditional remedies, or someone who'd once successfully removed an arrow from someone without killing them immediately. Medical school wasn't exactly a rigorous institution in medieval times, and most of what passed for medical knowledge was a fascinating combination of folk wisdom, religious superstition, and confident guessing. Your most common medical problems were predictable consequences of your working conditions. Standing on stone walls in all weather guaranteed that you'd develop joint problems, muscle aches, and respiratory issues. The damp, cold conditions were perfect for brewing bronchitis, pneumonia, and various other lung ailments that would plague you for the rest of your probably shortened life. Cuts, scrapes, and bruises were daily occurrences when you spent your time handling weapons and working around rough stone surfaces. These minor injuries might seem trivial, but in an era before antibiotics or proper wound care, any break in the skin was a potential gateway for infection. A simple cut from a rusty sword blade could easily turn into gangrene, blood poisoning, or death. The treatment for most wounds involved cleaning them with whatever was available, which might be water, ale, wine, or urine depending on the medical practitioner's preferred theory of wound care. Then the wound would be bandaged with cloth that may or may not have been clean, and you'd be told to pray for the best outcome. If infection set in, the treatment options were limited and terrifying. The wound might be cauterized with a red-hot iron, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Alternatively, various poultices made from herbs, animal dung, or crushed insects might be applied to draw out the evil humors that were believed to cause disease. Broken bones were set using whatever materials were available, and a rough understanding of how bones were supposed to fit together. Splints were made from wood, leather, or cloth, and held in place with rope or strips of fabric. There was no anesthesia, no x-rays to ensure proper alignment, and no follow-up care beyond hoping that everything healed correctly. Many guards developed permanent limps, crooked arms, or other deformities from poorly healed fractures. These injuries didn't necessarily end your career, but they did make an already difficult job even more challenging. A guard with a bad leg still had to climb stairs to tower duty, and a guard with a damaged sword arm still had to defend the walls. Internal injuries were essentially death sentences. If you were kicked by a horse, fell from a height, or took a serious blow to the torso, your chances of survival depended entirely on luck and the power of prayer. Medieval medicine had no understanding of internal bleeding, organ damage, or shock, so treatment consisted mainly of keeping you comfortable while nature took its course. Disease spread through castle populations like wildfire, aided by poor sanitation, overcrowding, and complete ignorance of how infections were transmitted. Dysentery was a constant threat that could kill you through dehydration and exhaustion. Typhus, carried by lice and fleas, regularly swept through military populations. Tuberculosis was endemic in damp, poorly ventilated living spaces like guard barracks. Skin conditions were universal among castle guards. Constant exposure to moisture, lack of bathing facilities, and wearing the same clothes for extended periods created perfect conditions for rashes, boils, and various fungal infections. These weren't just uncomfortable, they could become seriously infected and debilitating. Dental care consisted mainly of pulling teeth that had become too painful to ignore. There were no cavity fillings, no root canals, no preventive cleanings. You chewed food until your teeth wore down or fell out, and then you learned to gum your meals as best you could. Tooth extraction was performed with crude tools and no pain relief beyond perhaps a cup of strong ale. Eye injuries were common and often permanent. Stone chips from construction work, metal fragments from weapon maintenance, and simple accidents in dimly lit spaces could damage your vision. There were no corrective lenses, no surgical repairs, and no accommodations for visual impairment. A guard who couldn't see clearly was a guard who couldn't do his job effectively. Mental health was not a recognized medical concept. What we would now identify as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were considered character flaws or spiritual weaknesses. Guards who witnessed traumatic events, suffered from chronic stress, or developed what we'd call combat fatigue were expected to simply endure their symptoms without complaint or assistance. Sleep disorders were inevitable given your working conditions, but insomnia was treated as a personal failing rather than a medical issue. Guards who couldn't sleep during their off hours were often assumed to be lazy or undisciplined, rather than suffering from the natural consequences of irregular schedules and high stress. Pain management consisted mainly of alcohol, which was both the cause of and solution to many medical problems. Ale and wine were used as antiseptics, anesthetics, and general cure-alls. This approach had obvious limitations and often created more problems than it solved, but alternatives were limited. The concept of preventive medicine didn't exist. No one understood the connection between diet and health, exercise and fitness, or hygiene and disease prevention. You were expected to work until your body broke down, and then you were expected to continue working until you died or became completely unable to function. Chapter 6. The Social Ladder, and your position at the bottom. Medieval society was organized like a ladder, and as a castle guard, you were so far down the rungs that you could barely see daylight. Understanding your place in this hierarchy was crucial for survival, because stepping out of line could result in punishments ranging from public humiliation to actual death. At the top of the castle's social pyramid sat the lord and his immediate family. These were people who lived in a completely different world from yours, with fine clothes, educated conversation, and meals that actually contained recognizable food. You might see them occasionally from a distance, but direct interaction was rare and usually unpleasant for you. Below the lord's family came the household knights, professional warriors who had earned their position through birth, marriage, or exceptional service. These men wore real armor, carried quality weapons, and commanded respect from everyone in the castle. They lived in private chambers, ate at the lord's table, and generally existed in a sphere so far above yours that you might as well have been different species. The castle's administrative staff, stewards, clerks, and chamberlains, occupied a middle tier that was still far above your station. These men could read and write, handled the lord's business affairs, and had influence over daily castle operations. They wore fine clothes, commanded servants, and never had to stand on walls in freezing rain. Skilled craftsmen like the castle's blacksmith, carpenter, and mason held positions of respect based on their specialized knowledge. While they weren't noble-born, their skills made them valuable and gave them a certain status. They had workshops, apprentices, and the security that came from being genuinely needed for their expertise, rather than just their ability to hold a spear. The castle's domestic servants, cooks, maids, and stable hands were closer to your social level, but still ranked above guards in the daily hierarchy. Servants worked inside the castle, had regular contact with higher status individuals, and often knew valuable information about the lord's plans and preferences. You, as a castle guard, occupied one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder. You were above only the most desperate criminals and outcasts, and even that distinction was sometimes questionable. Your job was necessary but not skilled. dangerous but not honored, and temporary in the sense that most guards didn't live long enough to make it a career. This hierarchy wasn't just theoretical, it affected every aspect of your daily life. Where you slept, what you ate, how you were addressed, and what privileges you enjoyed, spoiler, you didn't enjoy many, were all determined by your position in the castle's social structure. The quality of your equipment reflected your status. Knights got custom-fitted armor made by master craftsmen. You got whatever was left over after everyone more important had been equipped. Your spear might have been carried by 6 different guards before you. Your mail shirt might not fit properly, and your helmet might have more dents than a merchant's coin purse. Your living quarters told the same story. Knights had private chambers with fireplaces, proper beds, and storage for their possessions. You shared a barracks room with a dozen other men, slept on straw, and owned exactly what you could carry in a single bag. Meal quality varied dramatically based on social position. The Lord's table featured multiple courses of expertly prepared dishes using the finest ingredients available. Knights ate well-cooked meat, fresh bread, and imported delicacies. You got pottage and hoped it wasn't moldy. Legal protections also followed the social hierarchy. A knight who killed a guard might face a fine or temporary loss of favor, but rarely execution. A guard who raised his hand against a knight would be hanged without question. Your word carried no weight in legal disputes, and accusations against higher status individuals were considered inherently suspect. Marriage options were limited by your social position. Noble families carefully arranged marriages to strengthen alliances and increase wealth. Knights could marry into merchant families or minor nobility. You could marry another servant, a peasant girl, or maybe the daughter of another guard if you were lucky. Educational opportunities were non-existent for someone of your status. Knights learned to read, write, and conduct themselves in polite society. You learned to hold a spear and follow orders. Any additional knowledge you acquired came from observation, conversation, or pure accident. Religious participation reflected social divisions as well. The Lord had a private chapel and personal chaplain. Knights sat in places of honor during church services. You stood in the back, if you were allowed in the church at all, and hoped that God wasn't too particular about social status when it came time for judgment. Even your name carried less weight than those of higher status individuals. Knights and nobles had family names, coats of arms, and reputations that preceded them. You were simply the guard, or perhaps Thomas the Spearman, if anyone bothered to distinguish you from the other interchangeable guards. Opportunities for advancement were extremely limited. A knight might win glory in battle and be rewarded with land or titles. A skilled craftsman might save money and establish his own workshop. You might, if you were incredibly lucky and survived long enough, be promoted to sergeant of the guard, which meant slightly better food and the responsibility for training new guards to be as miserable as you were. The psychological impact of constantly being reminded of your low status was significant. You lived in a world where your opinions didn't matter, your comfort was irrelevant, and your life was valued primarily for its utility in defending people who wouldn't acknowledge your existence under normal circumstances. This social stratification was enforced through both formal rules and informal customs. You knew exactly how to address people of different ranks, where you were allowed to go in the castle, and what behaviors were acceptable for someone of your station. Violating these social rules could result in punishment, dismissal, or worse. Chapter 7. Combat Training, or lack thereof. When you signed up to be a castle guard, you might have expected extensive military training to prepare you for the life or death situations you'd inevitably face. You might have imagined skilled weapons masters teaching you the finer points of swordplay, experienced sergeants drilling you in formation tactics, and comprehensive instruction in the arts of war. You would have been catastrophically disappointed. Medieval castle guard training operated on the revolutionary principle that the best way to learn combat was to figure it out yourself, while hoping that nobody tried to kill you during the learning process. The training regimen consisted primarily of, here's a spear, try not to die, followed by immediate assignment to actual guard duties where the consequences of incompetence could be permanently fatal. Your first introduction to weapons training typically came from whoever happened to be available when you arrived at the castle. This might be a grizzled veteran who actually knew what he was doing, but more often it was another guard who'd been promoted to training duty because he'd managed to survive longer than average and could demonstrate the basic concept of pointy end goes toward the enemy. The weapons themselves reflected the minimal investment the castle was willing to make in your education. Training spears were usually broken weapons that had been crudely repaired. Practice swords were blunt pieces of metal that bore only passing resemblance to actual weapons, and shields were often so damaged that they provided more historical insight than practical protection. Your training space was whatever courtyard area wasn't being used for more important activities. You shared the space with livestock, servants going about their daily work, and anyone else who happened to be passing through. There were no dedicated training facilities, no specialized equipment, and no schedule that prioritized your combat education over other castle operations. The duration of your training was determined more by immediate need than by your actual competence level. If the castle was currently well staffed with guards, you might get a week or two of basic instruction. If guards were desperately needed because of illness, desertion, or recent deaths, you might get an afternoon of hasty explanation before being handed a real weapon and assigned to an actual post. Spear training focused on the absolute basics: how to hold the weapon without dropping it, how to point it in the general direction of threats, and how to avoid accidentally stabbing your fellow guards during formation movements. Advanced techniques like tactical maneuvering, coordinated attacks, or defensive positioning were considered luxury skills that you'd hopefully pick up through observation and trial and error. The spear itself was both your primary weapon and your greatest source of frustration. At first glance, it seemed simple enough: a long wooden shaft with a metal point on the end. How hard could it be? The answer, as you quickly discovered, was extremely hard. The weapon was longer and heavier than it appeared, with a balance point that shifted depending on how you held it and where you positioned your hands. Learning to thrust effectively with a spear required understanding leverage, timing, and body mechanics that no one bothered to explain properly. You had to coordinate your arms, shoulders, back, and legs to generate power while maintaining accuracy and balance. The first time you attempted a proper thrust, you probably overextended, lost your footing, and ended up flat on your back while your instructor shook his head in disgust. Defensive spear work was even more challenging because it required predicting where attacks would come from and positioning your weapon to intercept them. Blocking with a spear meant using the wooden shaft to deflect enemy weapons, a technique that required split-second timing and often resulted in painful impacts when you mistimed the block and caught a sword edge on your knuckles. The reach advantage that made spears effective also made them unwieldy in close combat. If an enemy got inside your spear's effective range, the weapon became more hindrance than help. Learning to transition from spear fighting to hand-to-hand combat was a skill that required years of practice, but you got maybe a few hours of instruction before being declared trained. Sword training, if you received any at all, consisted mainly of learning how to draw your weapon without cutting yourself and how to swing it without losing your balance. The subtle arts of blade work, timing, distance, counterattacks, and defensive techniques were skills reserved for knights and professional soldiers who had years to perfect their craft. The sword you were issued was rarely suited to your height, reach, or strength. Medieval weapons weren't mass-produced with standardized specifications. They were forged by individual craftsmen with varying levels of skill and different ideas about optimal design. Your sword might be too heavy for effective manipulation, too light to deliver decisive blows, or simply poorly balanced in ways that made every swing feel awkward and ineffective. Learning proper sword grip was more complex than anyone explained. You had to hold the weapon firmly enough to maintain control during combat, but loosely enough to allow for quick adjustments and changes in technique. Too tight a grip led to hand fatigue and reduced sensitivity, while too loose a grip risked losing the weapon entirely during aggressive exchanges. Footwork, perhaps the most crucial aspect of sword fighting, was barely covered in your training. Effective sword combat required constant movement, advancing to attack, retreating to avoid enemy strikes, circling to gain advantageous positions, and pivoting to redirect momentum. These movements had to be coordinated with weapon handling in ways that felt completely unnatural to beginners. The concept of distance management in sword fighting was revolutionary to most new guards. You had to maintain the optimal range where your weapon was effective while staying outside the effective range of your opponent's weapon. This required constant awareness of both your own reach and your enemy's capabilities, skills that developed only through extensive practice that you didn't receive. Shield work was taught through the sophisticated method of having someone try to hit you while you attempted to block their attacks with a piece of wood strapped to your arm. You learned through painful experience that shields were heavy, unwieldy, and required coordination between your sword arm and shield arm that didn't come naturally to most people. The physics of shield defense were more complex than they initially appeared. Simply holding a shield in front of you wasn't enough. You had to angle it properly to deflect attacks rather than absorbing their full force. A poorly positioned shield could actually redirect enemy attacks toward vulnerable parts of your body, making you more likely to be injured than if you hadn't used a shield at all. Shield mobility was another crucial skill that received minimal attention during training. Effective shield work required constant adjustment, raising and lowering the shield to protect different target areas, extending it forward to intercept attacks at maximum distance, and pulling it back to allow for counterattacks. These movements had to be performed quickly and smoothly, while maintaining awareness of both your opponent's actions and your own weapon positioning. Archery training was often completely absent from guard instruction, despite the fact that archery was one of the most effective defensive weapons available to castle garrisons. Bows required years of practice to use effectively, and most castles couldn't afford to spend that kind of time and resources on expendable guards. If you had previous experience with hunting or poaching, you might be assigned to archery duty. If not, you'd probably never touch a bow during your entire service. When archery training was provided, it typically consisted of standing in front of hay bales and shooting arrows until you occasionally hit what you were aiming at. The instructors rarely explained proper shooting form, breathing techniques, or the mental discipline required for accurate archery. You learned through trial and error, wasting expensive arrows and developing bad habits that would plague your shooting for years. Medieval war bows were significantly more powerful than hunting bows, requiring tremendous upper body strength to draw effectively. Many guards lacked the physical conditioning necessary to use these weapons properly, leading to poor accuracy, muscle fatigue, and occasional injuries when the bowstring snapped back during a mishandled draw. Crossbow training was somewhat more common because crossbows required less physical strength and could be learned more quickly than traditional archery. However, crossbows were slower to reload, more expensive to manufacture, and more likely to malfunction than simple bows. Guards trained on crossbows learned to span the weapon using various mechanical aids, but they rarely received instruction on maintenance, repair, or proper care of the complex mechanisms. Formation fighting was taught through the time-honored tradition of shoving a group of untrained men together with spears and hoping they'd figure out how to move as a unit before someone got killed. The concept was simple: stand close together, point your spears forward, and try not to panic when armed enemies ran toward you screaming. The execution was considerably more complex than anyone bothered to explain. Effective formation fighting required precise spacing between individual guards. Too close together, and you'd interfere with each other's weapons. Too far apart, and enemies could slip between you and attack from advantageous positions. Finding the optimal spacing required practice and coordination that new guards rarely received. Communication within formations was crucial but rarely practiced. Guards needed to understand basic commands for advancing, retreating, wheeling, and changing formation shapes. These commands had to be heard and understood over the noise of combat, which meant they had to be simple, distinctive, and well rehearsed. Most guards learned these commands through osmosis rather than systematic instruction. The psychological aspects of formation fighting were completely ignored during training. Standing shoulder to shoulder with other men while facing determined enemies required a level of trust and group cohesion that couldn't be developed through a few hasty practice sessions. Guards had to trust that their companions wouldn't break and run when combat began, leaving gaps in the formation that could prove fatal to everyone involved. Your instructors often had questionable credentials for teaching combat techniques. Some were veterans of actual battles who'd learned through hard experience. Others were guards who'd been promoted to training duty because they'd shown marginal competence with weapons. A few were simply whoever was available when training needed to happen, regardless of their actual knowledge or teaching ability. The veterans who served as instructors carried their own limitations and biases. They had learned combat techniques under specific circumstances against particular types of enemies, and their knowledge might not be applicable to different tactical situations. Some veterans had developed personal quirks or non-standard techniques that worked for them but were difficult to teach to others. Many instructors had difficulty communicating their knowledge effectively. They knew how to fight, but they didn't necessarily know how to teach fighting. The gap between personal competence and instructional ability meant that valuable combat wisdom was often lost or poorly transmitted to new guards. The psychological aspects of combat training were completely ignored. No one prepared you for the reality of facing armed opponents who genuinely wanted to kill you. No one explained how fear would affect your ability to think clearly or follow instructions. No one taught you how to maintain discipline when watching your friends die violently beside you. The physiological effects of combat stress were unknown to medieval trainers. They didn't understand how adrenaline would affect your fine motor control, how tunnel vision would limit your awareness, or how auditory exclusion would prevent you from hearing commands during battle. You learned about these phenomena through direct experience, often at the worst possible moments. Fear management wasn't part of the curriculum because medieval culture viewed fear as a character flaw rather than a natural human response to life-threatening situations. Guards who admitted to being afraid were often punished or mocked rather than helped to develop coping mechanisms. This attitude created additional psychological pressure and made it more difficult for guards to function effectively under stress. Mock battles and combat exercises were rare luxuries that most guards never experienced. These required time, planning, and resources that castle administrators preferred to spend on more immediate needs. You might participate in 1 or 2 practice sessions during your entire service, and these were often poorly organized affairs that taught bad habits rather than useful skills. When mock battles were conducted, they typically lacked the intensity and chaos of real combat. Guards fought with blunted weapons against opponents who weren't trying to kill them, creating a false sense of security about their abilities. The absence of genuine life-or-death pressure meant that guards often developed overconfidence in techniques that might fail under real combat conditions. The scenarios used in training exercises were often unrealistic or outdated, based on commanders' past experiences rather than current tactical realities. Guards might train for siege defense scenarios that didn't match the actual threats they would face, or practice formations that were effective against enemies they'd never encounter. Equipment maintenance was covered briefly during training, but the instruction usually consisted of keep your weapons sharp and your armor oiled, without much explanation of how to actually accomplish these tasks effectively. You learn through trial and error that maintaining medieval weapons and armor was a complex, time-consuming process that required knowledge and tools you didn't possess. Weapon sharpening was an art that required understanding metal properties, angle geometry, and the different requirements of various weapon types. Spear points needed different edge angles than sword blades, and different parts of the same weapon might require different treatments. Most guards learned these distinctions through expensive mistakes that ruined weapons or reduced their effectiveness. Armor maintenance involved understanding leather care, metal treatment, and the complex interactions between different materials used in medieval protective gear. Leather components needed regular oiling to prevent cracking. Metal parts required protection from rust, and fabric elements had to be cleaned and repaired regularly. Guards who neglected armor maintenance often found their protection failing at critical moments. The tools required for proper equipment maintenance were expensive and often unavailable to common guards. Whetstones, oil, cleaning supplies, and repair materials had to be purchased with personal funds that most guards couldn't afford. This created a cycle where guards with poorly maintained equipment were more likely to be injured or killed, reducing their ability to earn money for better maintenance supplies. The transition from training to actual guard duty was typically abrupt and poorly managed. One day, you were practicing with blunt weapons in a controlled environment, and the next day, you were standing on castle walls with lethal weapons, responsible for defending against threats you'd never encountered. There was no gradual introduction to real responsibilities, no mentorship program, and no safety net if you proved incompetent. This sudden transition created a period of extreme vulnerability for new guards. They had theoretical knowledge of combat techniques but no practical experience applying those techniques under real conditions. The first few weeks of actual guard duty were often when casualties were highest among new recruits. The lack of ongoing training meant that guard skills often deteriorated over time rather than improving. Without regular practice and instruction, bad habits developed and good techniques were forgotten. Guards who had received minimal initial training often became less effective fighters as their service continued, rather than more skilled. Most of your actual combat education came from observing more experienced guards and hoping you'd have time to learn from their example before facing a life-threatening situation. This informal learning system meant that bad habits, incorrect techniques, and dangerous misconceptions were passed down through generations of guards like family heirlooms. The quality of informal instruction varied dramatically, depending on the knowledge and willingness of senior guards. Some veterans were excellent teachers who took pride in passing on their knowledge to newcomers. Others were secretive about their techniques, believing that sharing knowledge might create competition for advancement opportunities. Still, others had developed personal methods that worked for them but were impossible for others to replicate. The absence of standardized training protocols meant that guards from different castles, or even different companies within the same castle, might have completely different fighting styles and tactical approaches. This lack of standardization created coordination problems when guards had to work together in large formations or joint operations. Advanced combat techniques were rarely taught to common guards, who were expected to master only basic skills sufficient for routine duties. Specialized techniques for dealing with armored opponents, mounted enemies, or siege situations were reserved for professional soldiers and knights. This limitation left guards vulnerable when they encountered combat situations beyond their basic training. The economic incentives for providing quality training were minimal. Dead guards could be replaced relatively easily and cheaply, while extensive training programs required significant investments of time and resources. From a purely economic perspective, it often made more sense to accept higher casualty rates among poorly trained guards than to invest in comprehensive training programs. Chapter 8. The Night Shift Horror Show. Night duty was where castle guard service transformed from merely unpleasant to genuinely nightmarish. While day shifts had their own miseries, at least you could see what was trying to kill you. Night watch duty plunged you into a world of shadows, strange sounds, and paranoid terror that could drive men to madness or drink, often both. Your night shift began at sunset and lasted until dawn, which during winter months meant you'd be standing in darkness for up to 14 hours straight. There were no electric lights, no torches that lasted more than a few hours, and no relief from the psychological pressure of being surrounded by black void while responsible for detecting threats you couldn't see. The castle provided minimal lighting for guard duties, usually consisting of a few oil lamps or torches placed at strategic points along the walls. These created small pools of flickering light that somehow made the surrounding darkness seem even more impenetrable. The flames cast dancing shadows that transformed familiar objects into threatening shapes and made it impossible to distinguish between actual movement and optical illusions. Your night vision, such as it was, took time to develop and was easily ruined by any exposure to bright light. Looking directly at a torch or lamp would leave you effectively blind for several minutes afterward. This meant you had to choose between being able to see your immediate surroundings or maintaining your ability to detect movement in the darkness beyond the walls. The quality of medieval lighting was inconsistent and unreliable. Torches burned with uneven flames that flickered in the wind, creating constantly changing patterns of light and shadow. Oil lamps produced steadier light, but were expensive to maintain and often ran out of fuel at critical moments. Candles were too fragile for outdoor use and provided insufficient illumination for guard duties. The placement of lights created tactical challenges that guards had to navigate carefully. Standing too close to a light source made you visible to enemies while destroying your night vision. Standing too far away left you unable to see potential threats. Finding the optimal position required experience and judgment that new guards didn't possess. Maintaining lighting throughout long night shifts was a constant challenge. Someone had to monitor fuel levels, replace burned-out torches, and trim candle wicks to maintain consistent illumination. These maintenance tasks took guards away from their primary duties and created periods of reduced lighting that enemies might exploit. Weather conditions dramatically affected lighting effectiveness. Rain extinguished torches and made oil lamps sputter and smoke. Wind caused flames to flicker wildly, creating disorienting light patterns and threatening to blow out crucial illumination. Snow reflected available light, but also created confusing visual effects that made it difficult to distinguish between objects and shadows. The sounds of night duty were a constant source of stress and confusion. Every wind gust, every settling timber, every animal movement in the distance could potentially be an enemy approach. You learned to identify the normal nighttime sounds of the castle: creaking gates, restless horses, guards walking their beats, but distinguishing these from potential threats required experience that new guards didn't possess. Medieval castles were noisy places even at night. Timbers expanded and contracted with temperature changes, creating groaning and cracking sounds that could mask enemy movements. Animals in the stables shifted and snorted throughout the night. Servants moving through the castle on legitimate business created footsteps and voices that had to be distinguished from potential intruders. The acoustic properties of stone construction amplified and distorted sounds in unpredictable ways. Sounds echoed off walls, creating false impressions of direction and distance. Whispered conversations could carry surprising distances through corridors and courtyards, while loud noises might be muffled by thick walls and disappear completely. Guards had to develop the ability to interpret sounds they couldn't see. The rhythm of footsteps could indicate whether someone was walking normally, trying to move stealthily, or running in panic. The cadence of voices could suggest casual conversation, urgent communication, or hostile planning. These interpretive skills required experience that most guards gained through trial and error. Wildlife added another layer of auditory confusion to night watch duty. Owls, bats, and nocturnal animals created a symphony of strange noises that could mask the approach of human enemies. A rustling bush might be a rabbit foraging for food, or it might be a scout preparing for an attack. The psychological strain of making these distinctions hour after hour, night after night, wore down even experienced guards. Some sounds were genuinely threatening and required immediate response. The clatter of armor or weapons from unexpected directions, the sound of ropes or grappling hooks against stone walls, or the distinctive noise of scaling ladders being positioned against fortifications all indicated immediate danger that guards had to respond to quickly and effectively. The challenge was distinguishing genuine threats from false alarms without becoming so paranoid that every sound triggered a panic response. Guards who cried wolf too often lost credibility and might not be believed when real threats materialized. Conversely, guards who ignored potential threats to avoid embarrassment might miss actual attacks until it was too late to respond effectively. Weather made night duty exponentially more difficult and dangerous. Rain reduced visibility to almost nothing while creating noise that could mask enemy movements. The sound of rain on stone, wood, and fabric created a constant background noise that made it difficult to hear approaching threats. Heavy rain also made movement treacherous, as wet stone became slippery and dangerous to navigate in darkness. Snow reflected what little light was available, but also muffled sounds and made walking treacherous. Fresh snow created a blanket of silence that made it easier to hear distant sounds, but also allowed enemies to move more quietly by muffling their footsteps. Accumulated snow changed familiar terrain features, making it easy to become disoriented even in areas you knew well. Ice formations created additional hazards during winter night duty. Walkways became skating rinks, stairs turned into death traps, and handholds became too slippery to trust. Guards had to move more slowly and carefully, reducing their ability to respond quickly to threats while increasing their vulnerability to accidents. Wind howled through castle fortifications, carrying sounds from unexpected directions and making it impossible to pinpoint the source of suspicious noises. Strong winds could knock guards off balance, extinguish lights, and create constant noise that masked other sounds. Gusting wind caused banners, ropes, and loose materials to move and create visual distractions that could be mistaken for enemy activity. Fog created perhaps the most challenging weather conditions for night guards. Dense fog reduced visibility to a few feet while creating an eerie, disorienting environment where familiar landmarks disappeared entirely. Sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability that was psychologically devastating. The cold during night duty was a special kind of torture that went beyond mere discomfort. Standing motionless in winter darkness, your body gradually lost heat until you began to shiver uncontrollably. Extended exposure could lead to frostbite, hypothermia, and a dangerous loss of manual dexterity that made it difficult to handle weapons effectively. Medieval clothing provided inadequate protection against cold weather, especially during long periods of stationary duty. Woolen garments absorbed moisture and lost insulating properties when wet. Leather became stiff and uncomfortable in cold temperatures. Metal armor conducted cold directly to the body, making it feel like wearing a freezer. The physiological effects of cold extended beyond simple discomfort. Cold temperatures reduced blood flow to extremities, making hands and feet numb and clumsy. Reflexes slowed, thinking became sluggish, and decision-making abilities deteriorated. Guards suffering from cold exposure were less effective fighters and more likely to make mistakes that could prove fatal. Maintaining body heat during long night watches required constant effort and movement. Guards learned to exercise regularly, shifting weight from foot to foot, flexing muscles, and moving around their posts to maintain circulation. However, too much movement could compromise stealth and make guards more visible to enemies. Your fellow night guards were spread across the castle's defenses, often too far apart for easy communication. If you detected a potential threat, alerting other guards required either abandoning your post to find them or making noise that might give away your position to enemies. This isolation added psychological pressure to an already stressful situation. Communication between night guards relied on predetermined signals that were often inadequate for complex situations. Horn blasts could alert the entire castle to danger, but also warned enemies that their approach had been detected. Shouted warnings carried the same problems. Hand signals were useless in darkness, and light signals could reveal guard positions to enemies. The spacing of guard posts was a compromise between providing adequate coverage and maintaining communication capabilities. Posts that were too close together wasted manpower, while posts that were too far apart left gaps in coverage and made coordination difficult. Finding the optimal balance required experience and knowledge of local conditions that commanders often lacked. Guards developed informal communication methods to supplement official signals. Shared code words, distinctive movement patterns, and subtle sound signals allowed guards to share information without alerting potential enemies. However, these informal systems were often unreliable and could be misunderstood or missed entirely. The psychological impact of isolation during night duty was severe. Guards stood alone in darkness for hours, responsible for the safety of the entire castle, but unable to see most of what they were supposed to protect. This isolation bred anxiety, paranoia, and a sense of vulnerability that could affect performance and decision-making. Sleep deprivation was an inevitable consequence of night duty schedules that rarely allowed for adequate rest between shifts. You might finish a night watch at dawn, catch a few hours of sleep during the day, and then report for evening duties before starting another night shift. This cycle of exhaustion impaired your judgment, reflexes, and ability to distinguish between real threats and imagination. Medieval understanding of sleep and circadian rhythms was non-existent. Commanders didn't realize that rotating schedules and irregular sleep patterns had cumulative effects on guard performance. The assumption was that guards could adapt to any schedule through willpower and discipline, ignoring the physiological realities of sleep deprivation. The effects of chronic sleep loss extended beyond simple fatigue. Sleep-deprived guards experienced hallucinations, paranoid thoughts, and impaired memory function. They were more likely to fall asleep on duty, make poor decisions, and react inappropriately to potential threats. These effects accumulated over time, making long-term night duty assignments particularly dangerous. Guards tried various methods to stay alert during night watches, from physical exercise to consuming stimulating substances. Strong ale could provide temporary energy, but also impaired judgment and coordination. Herbal preparations might help maintain alertness, but were often ineffective or had unpleasant side effects. The darkness played tricks on your mind that could be genuinely terrifying. Familiar objects became menacing shapes. Distant sounds seemed to come from impossible directions. Your tired brain began creating threats that didn't exist, while potentially missing real dangers that were actually present. Many guards reported seeing enemy soldiers, hearing attack signals, or detecting movements that investigation revealed to be completely imaginary. Visual hallucinations were common among guards who spent extended periods in darkness. The human visual system, deprived of adequate input, began generating its own images that could be indistinguishable from reality. Guards saw armies approaching across empty fields, figures climbing walls that remained bare, and lights moving in areas where no lights existed. Auditory hallucinations were equally problematic. Guards heard voices calling their names, sounds of combat from distant locations, and warning signals that investigation revealed to be imaginary. These false perceptions could trigger inappropriate responses and waste time and energy that should have been devoted to real threats. The psychological stress of night duty created a feedback loop where anxiety about imaginary threats made guards more likely to experience hallucinations, which increased anxiety and made future hallucinations more probable. Breaking this cycle required experience, mental discipline, and support from fellow guards that wasn't always available. Equipment failures during night duty could be catastrophic. A broken lantern or extinguished torch left you in complete darkness. A faulty weapon discovered only when you tried to use it could mean the difference between life and death. Armor that shifted or loosened during long hours of standing could create noise that compromised your stealth or restricted your movement when quick action was required. Medieval equipment was unreliable under the best of circumstances, and night duty created particularly challenging conditions. Cold temperatures made leather, brittle, and metal parts more likely to break. Moisture from rain or snow could cause wooden components to swell and malfunction. Wind could extinguish lights or damage delicate mechanisms. Guards had to maintain their equipment in darkness, using only touch and limited light sources. Repairing a broken strap or adjusting a loose piece of armor required manual dexterity and tool use under conditions where mistakes could be dangerous. Many guards carried makeshift repair supplies, but these were often inadequate for serious equipment failures. The consequences of equipment failure during night duty were often more severe than similar failures during daylight hours. A guard who lost his weapon in darkness might not be able to find it again quickly. Armor that failed during a night attack left guards vulnerable when medical assistance was least available. Light sources that failed left guards blind and helpless at critical moments. Communication during night watches relied on predetermined signals that were often inadequate for complex situations. A simple horn blast might mean enemy approaching, but couldn't convey important details like numbers, direction, or type of threat. Hand signals were useless in darkness, and shouting instructions could alert enemies to your defensive preparations. The limited vocabulary of night signals created situations where guards had to make critical decisions based on incomplete information. A warning signal might indicate anything from a small scouting party to a full-scale assault, but guards had to respond without knowing which scenario they faced. This uncertainty made it difficult to choose appropriate responses and often led to either overreaction or inadequate preparation. Developing more sophisticated signaling systems required training and coordination that most castle garrisons lacked. Complex signals were more likely to be misunderstood or missed entirely, potentially creating more problems than they solved. The trade-off between signal complexity and reliability was difficult to balance. Guards often improvised communication methods during actual threats, using whatever means were available to share information. These improvised signals were unreliable and often misunderstood, but they were sometimes the only option available when formal communication systems proved inadequate. The psychological impact of repeated night duty was cumulative and severe. Guards who served for extended periods often developed anxiety disorders, chronic insomnia, and paranoid tendencies that persisted even during daylight hours. The constant stress of expecting attack combined with the sensory deprivation of darkness created mental health problems that medieval medicine had no ability to treat. Night duty changed guards' personalities and behavior patterns in ways that affected their relationships and social functioning. Guards became more suspicious, irritable, and withdrawn. They had difficulty trusting others and often developed obsessive behaviors related to security and threat detection. The social isolation of night duty compounded these psychological problems. Guards who worked primarily night shifts had limited contact with the normal social rhythms of castle life. They slept when others were active and worked when others were sleeping, creating a disconnection from the community they were supposed to protect. Some guards adapted to night duty better than others, developing coping mechanisms and mental discipline that allow. Chapter 8. The Night Shift Horror Show. Night duty was where castle guard service transformed from merely unpleasant to genuinely nightmarish. While day shifts had their own miseries, at least you could see what was trying to kill you. Night watch duty plunged you into a world of shadows, strange sounds, and paranoid terror that could drive men to madness or drink, often both. Your night shift began at sunset and lasted until dawn, which, during winter months, meant you'd be standing in darkness for up to 14 hours straight. There were no electric lights, no torches that lasted more than a few hours, and no relief from the psychological pressure of being surrounded by black void while responsible for detecting threats you couldn't see. The castle provided minimal lighting for guard duties, usually consisting of a few oil lamps or torches placed at strategic points along the walls. These created small pools of flickering light that somehow made the surrounding darkness seem even more impenetrable. The flames cast dancing shadows that transformed familiar objects into threatening shapes and made it impossible to distinguish between actual movement and optical illusions. Your night vision, such as it was, took time to develop and was easily ruined by any exposure to bright light. Looking directly at a torch or lamp would leave you effectively blind for several minutes afterward. This meant you had to choose between being able to see your immediate surroundings or maintaining your ability to detect movement in the darkness beyond the walls. The sounds of night duty were a constant source of stress and confusion. Every wind gust, every settling timber, every animal movement in the distance could potentially be an enemy approach. You learned to identify the normal nighttime sounds of the castle: creaking gates, restless horses, guards walking their beats. But distinguishing these from potential threats required experience that new guards didn't possess. Wildlife added another layer of auditory confusion to night watch duty. Owls, bats, and nocturnal animals created a symphony of strange noises that could mask the approach of human enemies. A rustling bush might be a rabbit foraging for food, or it might be a scout preparing for an attack. The psychological strain of making these distinctions hour after hour, night after night, wore down even experienced guards. Weather made night duty exponentially more difficult and dangerous. Rain reduced visibility to almost nothing while creating noise that could mask enemy movements. Snow reflected what little light was available, but also muffled sounds and made walking treacherous. Wind howled through castle fortifications, carrying sounds from unexpected directions and making it impossible to pinpoint the source of suspicious noises. The cold during night duty was a special kind of torture that went beyond mere discomfort. Standing motionless in winter darkness, your body gradually lost heat until you began to shiver uncontrollably. Extended exposure could lead to frostbite, hypothermia, and a dangerous loss of manual dexterity that made it difficult to handle weapons effectively. Your fellow night guards were spread across the castle's defenses, often too far apart for easy communication. If you detected a potential threat, alerting other guards required either abandoning your post to find them or making noise that might give away your position to enemies. This isolation added psychological pressure to an already stressful situation. Sleep deprivation was an inevitable consequence of night duty schedules that rarely allowed for adequate rest between shifts. You might finish a night watch at dawn, catch a few hours of sleep during the day, and then report for evening duties before starting another night shift. This cycle of exhaustion impaired your judgment, reflexes, and ability to distinguish between real threats and imagination. The darkness played tricks on your mind that could be genuinely terrifying. Familiar objects became menacing shapes. Distant sounds seemed to come from impossible directions. Your tired brain began creating threats that didn't exist while potentially missing real dangers that were actually present. Many guards reported seeing enemy soldiers, hearing attack signals, or detecting movements that investigation revealed to be completely imaginary. Equipment failures during night duty could be catastrophic. A broken lantern or extinguished torch left you in complete darkness. A faulty weapon discovered only when you tried to use it could mean the difference between life and death. Armor that shifted or loosened during long hours of standing could create noise that compromised your stealth or restricted your movement when quick action was required. Communication during night watches relied on predetermined signals that were often inadequate for complex situations. A simple horn blast might mean enemy approaching, but couldn't convey important details like numbers, direction, or type of threat. Hand signals were useless in darkness, and shouting instructions could alert enemies to your defensive preparations. The psychological impact of repeated night duty was cumulative and severe. Guards who served for extended periods often developed anxiety disorders, chronic insomnia, and paranoid tendencies that persisted even during daylight hours. The constant stress of expecting attack combined with the sensory deprivation of darkness created mental health problems that medieval medicine had no ability to treat. Bathroom breaks during night duty presented practical and security challenges that modern people rarely consider. Leaving your post was forbidden, but biological necessities didn't respect military discipline. Guards learned to relieve themselves while remaining at their positions, which was neither comfortable nor hygienic, but was preferable to facing punishment for abandoning their watch. Chapter 9. The Glamorous World of Castle Maintenance. Between the brief moments of terror when you might actually have to fight someone, castle guard duty consisted largely of maintenance work that would make a modern janitor weep with sympathy. Castles were complex structures that required constant upkeep, and guess who got volunteered for the most unpleasant maintenance tasks? That's right, you, the expendable guard with no other marketable skills. Your maintenance duties began with the glamorous task of cleaning and repairing the very walls you were supposed to defend. Stone fortifications accumulated dirt, moss, bird droppings, and various other substances that could compromise their structural integrity or provide handholds for climbing enemies. Armed with brushes, scrapers, and buckets of water, you spent countless hours scrubbing medieval grime from surfaces that stretched hundreds of feet in all directions. Wall maintenance also involved pointing, the process of repairing mortar joints between stones. This required climbing to dangerous heights with heavy buckets of mortar mix, working in precarious positions while trying not to fall to your death. The mortar itself was made from lime, sand, and water, creating a caustic mixture that burned your skin and produced choking dust clouds that filled your lungs with what felt like powdered stone. The castle's wooden structures required even more frequent attention than the stonework. Gates, doors, bridges, and walkways were constantly exposed to weather that warped, cracked, and rotted the timber. You learned basic carpentry skills out of necessity, becoming proficient with saws, hammers, and chisels not because you enjoyed woodworking, but because someone had to fix things when they broke. Roof maintenance was perhaps the most dangerous regular duty you faced. Castle roofs were steep, slippery when wet, and covered with tiles or thatch that provided unreliable footing. Armed with whatever tools were available, you climbed onto these treacherous surfaces to replace broken tiles, patch holes, and clear gutters. A single misstep could send you plummeting to the courtyard below, providing an abrupt end to your maintenance career. The castle's gates required constant attention to keep them functional. These massive wooden and iron structures were operated by complex systems of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights that seemed designed to malfunction at the worst possible moments. You spent hours oiling hinges, replacing worn rope, and adjusting mechanisms that had been built by craftsmen who'd been dead for decades. Cleaning duties extended far beyond simple tidying up. Castle courtyards accumulated mud, animal waste, food scraps, and human refuse that created health hazards and attracted vermin. Armed with shovels, rakes, and an iron stomach, You mucked out stables, cleaned latrines, and removed whatever unidentifiable substances had accumulated in corners and drainage areas. The castle's wells and water systems required regular maintenance to ensure safe drinking water for the garrison. This meant climbing down into deep, narrow shafts to clean sediment, remove debris, and repair stone lining. Well, maintenance was claustrophobic. Dangerous work performed in cramped spaces where a loose stone could crush you or contaminated water could poison the entire castle population. Weapons maintenance was theoretically your responsibility, though you were rarely provided with the tools or knowledge necessary to do the job properly. Sharpening spear points, oiling mail shirts, and repairing damaged shields required skills that took years to develop. Most guards performed basic maintenance badly, leading to equipment failures at critical moments. The castle's defensive mechanisms needed regular testing and adjustment to ensure they'd function during an actual attack. Trebuchets, ballistae, and other siege engines were complex machines with dozens of moving parts that could jam, break, or misalign. You learned to operate these devices through trial and error, hoping that your inexperience wouldn't result in catastrophic mechanical failures or accidental injuries. Storage areas throughout the castle required constant organization and inventory management. Food stores had to be rotated to prevent spoilage, weapons had to be cataloged and maintained, and supplies had to be accessible during emergencies. This mundane administrative work was essential for castle operations but received little recognition or reward. Pest control was an ongoing battle against rats, mice, insects, and birds that invaded every corner of the castle. These creatures destroyed food supplies, damaged equipment, and spread diseases throughout the garrison. Your pest control methods were primitive and often ineffective. Cats, traps, and poison were your primary weapons in a war you were clearly losing. The castle's heating systems, such as they were, required constant attention during cold months. Fireplaces had to be cleaned, chimneys had to be cleared of obstructions, and firewood had to be cut, split, and stored. This work was essential for survival during winter, but consumed enormous amounts of time and effort. Drainage systems throughout the castle needed regular clearing to prevent flooding during heavy rains. Gutters, downspouts, and drainage channels collected leaves, debris, and various substances that blocked water flow. Cleaning these systems was wet, dirty work that often required crawling through narrow spaces in complete darkness. The psychological impact of endless maintenance duties was significant. You'd signed up to be a warrior defending the realm, but instead you spent most of your time doing manual labor that any peasant could perform. The contrast between your romantic expectations and mundane reality was a constant source of frustration and disillusionment. Chapter 10: Personal Hygiene in the Dark Ages. Medieval concepts of personal cleanliness operated on principles that would horrify modern germaphobes and confuse public health officials. As a castle guard, your relationship with hygiene was complicated by limited resources, medieval medical theories, and the practical challenges of maintaining cleanliness while living in stone buildings designed more for defense than comfort. Bathing was not a regular occurrence in your life. The castle might have bathing facilities, but they were typically reserved for nobility and important guests. Your access to washing facilities consisted of whatever water you could obtain from wells, streams, or rain collection systems. During winter, this water was often near freezing, making the bathing experience more torture than cleansing. The frequency of your baths depended largely on weather, water availability, and your personal tolerance for your own smell. Some guards managed to bathe once a week during summer months, while others went months between proper washings. Most guards developed a personal odor that could be detected from considerable distances, creating a natural social distancing effect in crowded spaces. Soap was a luxury item that most guards couldn't afford. When available, medieval soap was harsh, caustic stuff made from animal fat and wood ash that removed dirt but also stripped skin of natural oils, leaving you red, raw, and uncomfortable. Many guards used sand, rough cloth, or simply cold water to scrub away the most obvious dirt and grime. Your clothing presented hygiene challenges that had no good solutions. You owned perhaps 2 or 3 sets of garments, which meant wearing the same clothes for weeks at a time. Washing clothes required time, water, and somewhere to dry them, luxuries that were often unavailable. Most guards developed a rotation system where they'd wash one set of clothes while wearing another, but this still meant living in garments that had absorbed weeks of sweat, dirt, and various bodily fluids. Undergarments, if you had them at all, were simple linen garments that received even less frequent washing than your outer clothes. These items absorbed the majority of your bodily secretions and developed their own ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and microscopic life forms. Changing undergarments was cause for celebration, assuming you had clean replacements available. Hair care consisted mainly of occasional washing with cold water and perhaps combing with a wooden or bone comb to remove the largest debris. Most guards kept their hair relatively short for practical reasons. Long hair collected dirt, provided handholds for enemies, and could get caught in armor or weapons. Shaving was performed with sharp knives when possible, though many guards simply let their beards grow wild. Dental hygiene relied on primitive methods that were often more harmful than helpful. Some guards chewed on twigs or rough cloth to clean their teeth, while others used salt, sand, or abrasive powders that wore away tooth enamel. Toothbrushes wouldn't be invented for centuries, and dental problems were simply endured until teeth fell out or became too painful to ignore. Body odor was a universal constant that everyone learned to ignore out of necessity. The combination of infrequent bathing, unwashed clothes, poor diet, and stressful working conditions created personal fragrances that would clear modern elevators. Guards developed a tolerance for human smells that bordered on the supernatural. Laundry facilities in castles were basic at best. Washing clothes meant carrying them to the nearest water source, scrubbing them with whatever cleaning agents were available, and hanging them somewhere to dry. During winter, wet clothes might freeze solid before drying, creating ice-stiff garments that were painful to wear and offered no warmth. Vermin infestations were inevitable consequences of poor hygiene and crowded living conditions. Lice, fleas, and other parasites lived in your clothes, hair, and bedding, creating constant itching and discomfort. These creatures also carried diseases that could spread rapidly through the guard population. Delousing involved time-consuming searches through clothing seams and hair, picking out individual insects by hand. The castle's sanitation systems were primitive and often inadequate for the population they served. Latrines were typically simple holes in the ground or chutes that dropped waste into moats or rivers. These facilities provided minimal privacy and were often shared by dozens of people, creating both hygiene challenges and social awkwardness. Hand washing was rare and usually performed only before eating or after handling particularly dirty materials. The connection between hand hygiene and disease prevention wasn't understood, so guards routinely handled food, weapons, and personal items with hands that had touched everything from animal waste to infected wounds. Feminine hygiene presented special challenges for the few women who lived in castle environments. Medieval understanding of women's health was minimal and often wrong, leading to practices that were uncomfortable, unhealthy, and sometimes dangerous. Women had to manage menstruation with cloth rags that were difficult to clean and impossible to replace frequently. Illness often made hygiene problems worse. Sick guards were less able to maintain what little cleanliness they normally managed, while their symptoms often included sweating, vomiting, or other bodily functions that created additional cleaning challenges. The combination of illness and poor hygiene created cycles of infection that could devastate entire garrisons. The psychological impact of constant uncleanliness affected morale and self-respect. Guards who had grown up with minimal hygiene standards adapted relatively well, but those who remembered better times often struggled with the degradation of their personal standards. The inability to feel clean contributed to depression and social withdrawal. Chapter 11. Entertainment and Leisure, What Little There Was. When you finished your guard duties, if you ever actually finished them, you faced the challenge of finding ways to occupy your mind during the brief periods when you weren't required to stand on walls, maintain equipment, or perform manual labor. Medieval entertainment options for castle guards were limited, crude, and often involved activities that would result in immediate arrest in modern society. Gambling was the most popular form of entertainment among guards, primarily because it offered the theoretical possibility of improving your financial situation while providing excitement during otherwise monotonous periods. Dice games were universal, played with bone or wooden cubes that were often carved by guards during quiet moments. The dice were frequently weighted or otherwise altered to provide advantages to their owners, making every game a combination of chance and fraud detection. Card games hadn't been invented yet, so dice provided most gambling entertainment. Popular games included simple betting on single die rolls, more complex games involving multiple dice and mathematical calculations that exceeded the educational background of most participants, and elaborate competitions that could last for hours and involve significant financial stakes. Wagering extended beyond formal games to betting on virtually any event that had an uncertain outcome. Guards bet on weather patterns, the outcomes of disputes between nobles, the likelihood of enemy attacks, and the survival prospects of new recruits. These bets created informal financial networks within the castle and provided topics of conversation during long watches. Storytelling was another major form of entertainment, though the quality and content of stories varied dramatically depending on the literacy and imagination of the storytellers. Most guards were illiterate, so stories were passed down orally and gradually changed through repetition until they bore little resemblance to their original versions. Popular story themes included heroic battles, greatly exaggerated, romantic adventures, heavily fantasized, supernatural encounters, completely fabricated, and humorous anecdotes about the stupidity of nobles, clergy, or other guards. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, and psychological escape from the realities of guard life. Some guards developed reputations as skilled storytellers and were sought out during quiet periods for their ability to spin entertaining tales. These individuals often embellished their stories with sound effects, dramatic gestures, and interactive elements that made them medieval equivalents of stand-up comedians. Drinking was both entertainment and medication for many guards. Ale and wine were safer than water in many castles, but they also provided temporary relief from the psychological stresses of guard duty. Group drinking sessions created social bonding opportunities and allowed guards to complain about their working conditions without seeming disloyal. Alcohol consumption often led to other forms of entertainment, including singing, dancing, and various competitive activities that seemed like good ideas after several cups of ale, but resulted in injuries, arguments, and disciplinary actions the following day. Drunk guards were notoriously creative in finding ways to hurt themselves and others. Physical competitions provided outlets for aggression and opportunities to demonstrate skills that might be useful in combat situations. Wrestling matches were popular because they required no equipment and could be held in small spaces. Boxing competitions used bare fists and primitive rules that generally amounted to hit your opponent until he stops moving. Contests involving weapon skills allowed guards to practice combat techniques while competing for small prizes or bragging rights. Spear throwing, sword fighting with blunted weapons, and archery competitions helped maintain military readiness while providing entertainment during off-duty hours. Music was limited by the availability of instruments and musical knowledge among the guards. Simple flutes, drums, and stringed instruments might be available, though most guards lacked the skill to play them well. Singing was more common, though the quality was variable and the song selections were often inappropriate for polite company. Popular songs included military marching tunes, drinking songs with increasingly elaborate verses, ballads about legendary heroes, and crude compositions that would make modern audiences blush. Group singing sessions helped build camaraderie and provided emotional outlets for guards who had limited ways to express their feelings. Crafts and hobbies allowed some guards to develop skills beyond basic military functions. Carving wooden figures, making simple jewelry, weaving baskets, and similar activities provided productive ways to spend time while creating items that could be traded or sold for small amounts of money. These hobby activities also served therapeutic purposes, allowing guards to create something beautiful or useful in lives that were otherwise focused on destruction and violence. The concentration required for detailed craft work provided mental relief from the constant stress of military service. Sexual entertainment existed but was complicated by the limited number of women in castle environments and the strict social hierarchies that governed interactions between different classes. Prostitution was common in larger castles and nearby towns, though guards often lacked the money to afford such services regularly. Romantic relationships between guards and servants, local women, or each other provided emotional comfort and physical release. Though these relationships were often temporary and complicated by the harsh realities of medieval life. Marriage was possible, but created additional financial pressures and responsibilities that many guards couldn't handle. Board games existed but were rare and usually reserved for nobility and educated individuals. Chess, backgammon, and similar strategic games required leisure time and intellectual development that most guards didn't possess. Simpler games using pebbles, sticks, or marked boards provided some strategic entertainment. Religious observances provided structured entertainment and social interaction, though the religious content was often secondary to the social aspects. Church services, religious festivals, and holy day celebrations offered breaks from routine and opportunities to interact with people outside the military hierarchy. Practical jokes and pranks were common forms of entertainment that ranged from harmless fun to dangerous harassment. New guards were favorite targets for elaborate initiation rituals, false information about castle procedures, and physical pranks that could result in genuine injuries. These jokes served multiple purposes. They relieved boredom, established social hierarchies within the guard population, and provided veterans with opportunities to assert dominance over newcomers. However, pranks could also create serious conflicts and undermine unit cohesion when they went too far. Chapter 12. The Economics of Survival. Money was simultaneously the most important and most elusive aspect of castle guard life. Your relationship with currency was complicated by irregular pay schedules, economic systems you didn't understand, and the constant tension between earning enough to survive and finding opportunities to spend what little you earned. Your wages as a castle guard placed you somewhere between barely surviving and slowly starving on the medieval economic spectrum. Payment typically came in the form of silver coins, though the amount and frequency varied dramatically based on the lord's financial situation, political circumstances, and whether he remembered that guards needed to eat occasionally. A typical guard's annual wages might equal what a skilled craftsman earned in a few months, assuming you actually received all the money you were owed. Payment delays were common and could last for weeks or months, particularly during times when the lord's attention was focused on warfare, politics, or other expensive activities that took priority over guard salaries. The purchasing power of your wages was further complicated by medieval pricing systems that would confuse modern economists. The cost of basic necessities like food, clothing, and tools fluctuated wildly based on seasonal availability, local conflicts, trade disruptions, and various other factors beyond your control or understanding. Bread, your primary food source, might cost a penny one week and 3 pennies the next, depending on harvest conditions, transportation costs, and the baker's mood. A cup of ale could range from affordable to financially ruinous, based on factors you had no way of predicting or influencing. Your clothing expenses consumed a significant portion of your income, primarily because medieval garments wore out quickly under the harsh conditions of guard duty. A replacement tunic might cost several days' wages, while a new cloak could represent weeks of savings. Quality clothing was expensive and often beyond your financial reach, forcing you to choose between durability and affordability. Footwear was a particularly expensive necessity that caused ongoing financial stress. Boots suitable for guard duty needed to be waterproof, durable, and warm, qualities that commanded premium prices. Cheap boots fell apart quickly, creating a cycle where you spent more money replacing inferior products than you would have spent buying quality items initially. Weapons and armor maintenance required regular financial investments that competed with basic survival needs. Spear points needed sharpening or replacement, mail shirts required oiling and repair, and damaged equipment had to be fixed or replaced at your own expense. The cost of maintaining your military gear often exceeded your ability to pay for it properly. Medical expenses could devastate your personal finances with little warning. While castle medical care was theoretically provided by your employer, effective treatment often required paying healers, purchasing medicines, or traveling to distant locations where skilled practitioners could be found. A serious injury or illness could leave you both physically incapacitated and financially ruined. Your limited income created difficult choices between present needs and future security. Spending money on better food improved your health and energy levels but reduced your ability to save for emergencies. Investing in quality equipment enhanced your survival prospects but left you vulnerable to financial crises. The absence of banking systems or credit mechanisms meant that financial planning was primitive and risky. Your wealth consisted entirely of whatever coins you could hide in your personal possessions, making theft a constant concern. Guards often buried money in secret locations, sewed coins into clothing, or devised other concealment methods that were unreliable and often unsuccessful. Gambling represented both opportunity and threat to your financial stability. Successful wagering could supplement your income significantly, while losing streaks could consume months of savings in a single evening. The psychological appeal of gambling often outweighed rational financial planning, leading many guards into cycles of temporary wealth followed by extended poverty. Debt was a persistent threat that could destroy your life more effectively than enemy weapons. Borrowing money to cover basic expenses, gambling losses, or emergency medical care created obligations that were difficult to repay on a guard's salary. Medieval debt collection methods were often violent and could result in imprisonment, enslavement, or death. The castle's economic system created additional financial pressures through various taxes, fees, and required contributions that reduced your effective income. You might be charged for damaged equipment, required to contribute to group purchases of supplies, or taxed to fund castle improvements that provided no direct benefit to guards. Side jobs and supplementary income sources were necessary for survival, but limited by your schedule and skills. Guards might work as laborers during off-duty hours, sell handmade crafts, or provide services like letter writing for illiterate castle residents. These activities provided essential additional income, but further reduced your already limited rest time. The seasonal nature of medieval economy affected your financial situation throughout the year. Summer months typically offered more opportunities for supplementary income and lower costs for heating and warm clothing. Winter brought increased expenses for fuel, food, and clothing, while reducing opportunities for additional earnings. Retirement planning was a concept that hadn't been invented yet, leaving guards to face old age without resources or support systems. Most guards worked until they were physically unable to continue, at which point they faced poverty, homelessness, or dependence on family members who might be equally impoverished. The economic vulnerability of guard positions meant that job security was minimal and financial planning was nearly impossible. Guards could be dismissed without notice, replaced during reorganizations, or left unemployed when political situations changed. This uncertainty made long-term financial goals unrealistic and forced guards to focus on immediate survival rather than future prosperity. Chapter 13: The Psychological Toll. The mental and emotional impact of castle guard service extended far beyond the physical hardships of the job. Living in a constant state of vigilance while performing dangerous, tedious work in harsh conditions created psychological stresses that medieval medicine had no ability to recognize or treat. Chronic anxiety was perhaps the most universal psychological condition among castle guards. The knowledge that your life could end violently at any moment, combined with the responsibility for detecting threats that might never materialize, created a state of constant tension that wore down mental defenses over time. This anxiety manifested in various ways: difficulty sleeping, jumpiness at unexpected sounds, obsessive checking and rechecking of equipment, and paranoid suspicion of strangers or unusual activities. Guards often developed hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax even during off-duty periods. The monotony of guard duty created its own psychological challenges. Standing in the same position for hours, walking the same patrol routes repeatedly, and performing identical tasks day after day led to a numbing boredom that could be more mentally devastating than actual danger. This boredom was particularly problematic because it had to be maintained while remaining alert for potential threats. Guards had to stay mentally engaged with essentially nothing happening, creating a cognitive dissonance that exhausted mental resources and contributed to attention failures at critical moments. Social isolation was another significant psychological burden. Guards were separated from their families and home communities, living among strangers who might not share their language, customs, or values. The hierarchical nature of castle society meant that guards had few opportunities for meaningful social connections with people of higher or lower status. The bonds formed between fellow guards provided some relief from isolation, but these relationships were often temporary and superficial. Guards were frequently transferred, killed, or dismissed, making emotional investments in friendships risky and painful when relationships inevitably ended. Violence, when it occurred, left lasting psychological scars that guards had no framework for understanding or treating. Witnessing violent deaths, participating in combat, or surviving attacks created traumatic memories that haunted guards long after the immediate danger had passed. Medieval culture provided no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder or treatment for combat-related psychological injuries. Guards who developed what we would now recognize as PTSD symptoms were often considered cowardly, weak, or possessed by evil spirits. This lack of understanding made recovery impossible and often worsened psychological damage. The powerlessness inherent in guard positions created feelings of helplessness and frustration that contributed to depression and anger. Guards had no control over their working conditions, no voice in decisions that affected their lives, and no realistic prospects for improving their situations through their own efforts. This powerlessness was particularly difficult for men who had grown up expecting to have some degree of autonomy and control over their lives. The transition from independent peasant farmers or craftsmen to completely subordinate military personnel was psychologically jarring and difficult to accept. Guilt and moral conflict arose from the violent nature of guard duties, and the questionable ethics of some orders guards were required to follow. Participating in executions, suppressing civilian populations, or enabling the oppression of peasants created moral dilemmas that guards were not equipped to resolve. These moral conflicts were compounded by religious teachings that emphasized mercy, compassion, and protection of the innocent, values that often contradicted the realities of military service. Guards who tried to reconcile their faith with their duties often experienced spiritual crises that had no clear resolution. Sleep disorders were endemic among guard populations due to irregular schedules, stress, uncomfortable sleeping conditions, and the psychological hypervigilance that made deep relaxation difficult. Chronic sleep deprivation impaired judgment, increased irritability, and contributed to both physical and mental health problems. The psychological impact of poor living conditions extended beyond simple discomfort to genuine degradation of mental health. Living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions with inadequate privacy created stress levels that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. Substance abuse became a coping mechanism for many guards who used alcohol to self-medicate psychological problems they couldn't otherwise address. While drinking provided temporary relief from anxiety, depression, and trauma symptoms, it also created additional problems, including health issues, disciplinary troubles, and financial difficulties. The absence of professional mental health care meant that guards developed their own informal support systems and coping strategies. Some of these were helpful, like peer counseling and group activities that provided emotional outlets. Others were destructive, including violence, gambling, and various forms of self-destructive behavior. Superstition and magical thinking often filled the psychological void left by the absence of scientific understanding of mental health. Guards attributed psychological symptoms to curses, evil spirits, or divine punishment, leading to ineffective treatments that sometimes worsened their conditions. The stigma associated with mental health problems in medieval culture prevented guards from seeking help even when resources were available. Admitting to psychological difficulties was often seen as evidence of weakness or cowardice, qualities that could result in dismissal, punishment, or social ostracism. Chapter 14. When Things Went Horribly Wrong. Castle guard service carried the constant possibility that routine duties would suddenly transform into life-threatening emergencies with little or no warning. When actual conflicts occurred, all the theoretical aspects of your training and preparation were tested under conditions that often revealed how inadequately prepared you really were. Siege warfare was the ultimate test of castle defenses and the guards responsible for maintaining them. When enemy forces surrounded your castle and began systematic attempts to breach the walls, your life became a series of increasingly desperate struggles to prevent various forms of violent death. The early stages of a siege created psychological pressure that was almost as dangerous as physical attacks. Knowing that you were trapped inside stone walls, while hostile forces gathered outside, created anxiety levels that could break men's minds before the actual fighting began. The sight of enemy siege engines being constructed within view of your position was particularly demoralizing. Food and water shortages during extended sieges transformed castle life into a slow-motion disaster where guards had to maintain defensive readiness while gradually starving. Rationing systems gave guards minimal sustenance while requiring them to perform physically demanding duties that consumed more calories than they were receiving. Disease outbreaks during sieges could devastate defending forces more effectively than enemy weapons. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and stressed immune systems created perfect conditions for plague, dysentery, typhus, and other infectious diseases that spread rapidly through garrison populations. Direct assaults on castle walls placed guards in situations where survival depended more on luck than skill. Standing on battlements while enemy archers shot volleys of arrows required courage that bordered on madness, especially when you knew that your armor provided minimal protection against direct hits. Siege engines like trebuchets and catapults hurled massive stones, burning materials, and sometimes diseased corpses over castle walls with devastating effects. Guards had to maintain their positions while chunks of masonry fell around them and incendiary materials set wooden structures ablaze. Scaling ladder attacks forced guards into hand-to-hand combat situations for which their training had provided minimal preparation. Fighting enemies who were climbing ladders while you stood on narrow walks required balance, coordination, and combat skills that most guards didn't possess. The psychological pressure of knowing that a single mistake could send you plummeting to your death added another layer of difficulty to already challenging combat situations. Underground mining operations by besieging forces created a different kind of terror. Knowing that enemies were tunneling beneath the castle walls while you stood guard above them created psychological stress that was difficult to endure. The constant fear that the ground might collapse without warning made even routine duties feel like walking on a minefield. Counter-mining operations required guards to descend into narrow, unstable tunnels where they might encounter enemy miners in brutal underground combat. These fights took place in cramped, dark spaces where conventional weapons were useless, and victory often went to whoever was more desperate or more willing to risk tunnel collapse. Fire was perhaps the most feared aspect of siege warfare because it could spread rapidly through wooden structures and was extremely difficult to control. Guards faced impossible choices between abandoning defensive positions to fight fires or maintaining their posts while watching parts of the castle burn around them. Attempts to break sieges through sorties or desperate attacks required guards to leave the relative safety of the castle walls and engage enemy forces in open combat. These operations were typically suicide missions disguised as tactical maneuvers, designed more to inflict casualties on besiegers than to achieve meaningful military objectives. When castle defenses finally failed, guards faced the terrifying prospect of surviving the sack of their fortress. Enemy forces that had endured the hardships of siege warfare were rarely inclined toward mercy, and the fall of a castle often resulted in massacre, torture, and systematic destruction that spared few defenders. The aftermath of failed defense often meant death, enslavement, or escape into countryside that might be equally dangerous. Guards who survived the fall of their castle faced uncertain futures as homeless refugees with combat experience but no legitimate employment prospects. Even when sieges ended successfully, the psychological and physical toll on surviving guards was enormous. Months of stress, malnutrition, disease, and combat left permanent marks on both body and mind that affected guards for the remainder of their often shortened lives. Natural disasters created their own category of emergency situations that tested castle defenses and guard capabilities. Earthquakes could damage walls and towers while guards were standing on them, creating situations where structural collapse posed immediate threats to defensive personnel. Floods could undermine castle foundations, contaminate water supplies, and make defensive positions unusable. Guards might find themselves trapped in towers surrounded by rising water, with no means of escape and dwindling supplies of food and fresh water. Fires started by lightning, kitchen accidents, or enemy action could spread rapidly through castle structures. Guards had to balance firefighting duties with maintaining defensive readiness, often while choking on smoke and working in extreme heat that made armor unbearably hot. Severe weather events like blizzards, ice storms, or hurricane-force winds could make guard duties physically impossible while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. Guards faced choices between abandoning their posts and risking death from exposure to weather conditions. Disease outbreaks within castle populations created situations where guards had to maintain security while potentially infected with fatal illnesses. Plague, cholera, or other epidemic diseases could kill more guards than enemy action, while requiring survivors to dispose of contaminated bodies and maintain quarantine procedures. Political upheavals and changes in lordship could transform loyal guards into enemy combatants overnight. Guards who had served faithfully for years might suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of dynastic disputes, religious conflicts, or territorial wars that redefined their allegiances without consulting their preferences. Mutinies and internal conflicts within castle garrisons created situations where guards faced combat against their former comrades. These conflicts were particularly brutal because both sides knew each other's capabilities, weaknesses, and tactical preferences. Supply failures during critical periods could leave guards without adequate food, water, weapons, or other essential resources. These shortages forced impossible choices between maintaining defensive readiness and meeting basic survival needs. Communication breakdowns during emergencies meant that guards often faced life-threatening situations without clear orders, adequate information, or coordination with other defensive elements. Operating under uncertainty while making decisions that could affect the entire castle's survival was a responsibility that few guards were prepared to handle. Equipment failures during combat situations could be immediately fatal. Weapons that broke at critical moments, armor that failed under stress, or defensive mechanisms that malfunctioned during attacks transformed survivable situations into disasters. The unpredictable nature of medieval warfare meant that guards had to be prepared for threats that might never materialize while remaining ready to respond to emergencies that could develop with little warning. This constant state of preparedness was psychologically exhausting and often proved inadequate when actual crises occurred. Chapter 15: The End of the Road. Castle guard service rarely ended with comfortable retirement, peaceful resignation, or gradual transition to civilian life. Most guards faced conclusions to their military careers that were abrupt, violent, or both. Understanding how guard service typically ended provides insight into why few men chose this profession voluntarily, and fewer still survived long enough to regret their decision. Death in combat was statistically the most common conclusion to a guard's career. Whether during siege warfare, raids, or simple patrol duties gone wrong, the violent nature of the job made premature death more likely than survival to old age. Combat deaths were often brutal, painful affairs that bore no resemblance to the heroic endings depicted in romantic literature. Dying from disease was nearly as common as combat death, but received less recognition or honor. Plague, dysentery, typhus, and other epidemic diseases killed guards with depressing regularity, often sweeping through entire garrisons and leaving survivors to dispose of their comrades' bodies while trying not to succumb to the same illnesses. Accidental deaths occurred with surprising frequency among men who worked with weapons, machinery, and dangerous architecture on a daily basis. Falls from walls, equipment malfunctions, friendly fire incidents, and construction accidents claimed guards who had survived enemy action only to be killed by the routine hazards of their working environment. Dismissal for cause could end a guard's career suddenly and leave him without resources, references, or prospects for future employment. Guards could be dismissed for cowardice, incompetence, insubordination, theft, or simply being in the wrong place when superiors needed someone to blame for problems beyond their control. Disability from injuries, disease, or simple wear and tear forced many guards into premature retirement when their bodies could no longer meet the physical demands of the job. Medieval society had no disability benefits, pension systems, or support services for incapacitated veterans, leaving disabled guards to face poverty and homelessness. Desertion was a common but dangerous method of ending guard service. Guards who abandoned their posts faced severe punishments if caught, including execution, imprisonment, or forced return to service under worse conditions. However, the prospect of continuing guard service often seemed worse than the risks of desertion. Some guards managed to transition into other occupations that utilized their military experience. Former guards might become mercenaries, bandits, town watchmen, or private security for wealthy merchants. These careers often offered better pay and working conditions than castle service, though they carried their own risks and uncertainties. Marriage could provide an exit strategy for guards who found partners willing to support them while they learned civilian trades. However, guard service made it difficult to maintain relationships or accumulate the resources necessary for marriage and family life. Religious conversion offered another potential escape route for guards who could convince monastic communities to accept them as brothers. Monastery life was harsh but provided security, regular meals, and spiritual purpose that many guards found appealing after years of military service. Geographic relocation allowed some guards to escape their pasts and start over in distant locations where their reputations and service records were unknown. This strategy required resources for travel and starting new lives, which most guards lacked. Advancement within castle hierarchies was theoretically possible, but rarely achieved in practice. A few guards might be promoted to sergeant positions, but advancement beyond that level required connections, education, and opportunities that were seldom available to common soldiers. Criminal activity provided income opportunities for guards whose military skills transferred well to robbery, extortion, and violence for hire. Former guards often became leaders of bandit groups or enforcers for criminal organizations, using their combat experience and knowledge of military tactics. Age-related decline forced older guards out of active service when their reflexes slowed, their strength diminished, and their health deteriorated to the point where they could no longer perform essential duties. These veterans faced difficult transitions to civilian life with minimal resources and limited skills. Political changes could end guard careers when new lords took control of castles and replaced existing staff with their own followers. Guards who had served loyally for years might be dismissed without compensation or warning when political circumstances changed. Economic pressures could force castle lords to reduce garrison sizes, leaving guards unemployed through no fault of their own. These economic dismissals often occurred during the worst possible times when alternative employment was scarce and resources were limited. Some guards simply disappeared, whether through desertion, accident, or foul play. Medieval record-keeping was inadequate for tracking individual soldiers, and guards could vanish without leaving traces of their ultimate fates. The psychological toll of guard service sometimes led to mental breakdowns that ended careers even when physical capabilities remained intact. Guards who could no longer cope with stress, violence, or isolation might abandon their posts or behave in ways that forced their dismissal. Legal troubles could end guard careers when off-duty misconduct resulted in imprisonment, exile, or execution. Guards who were caught stealing, fighting, or violating local laws faced consequences that often included termination of employment. Family emergencies occasionally forced guards to leave service to deal with personal crises. Deaths of family members, inheritance disputes, or obligations to dependents could require immediate departure from military service, though castle lords were rarely sympathetic to personal problems. The rare guards who managed to survive long enough to become genuinely old-faced retirement with minimal resources and few options. These veterans might be kept on in reduced capacities as gatekeepers or advisors, but their futures remained uncertain and often impoverished. Conclusion: the bitter truth. So there it is, the unvarnished reality of what it truly meant to be a medieval castle guard. While modern movies and books paint romantic pictures of noble warriors defending honor and realm, the truth was far more brutal and depressing. You were an expendable cog in a military machine that consumed men like kindling and offered little in return except the promise of an early grave. Your life was spent standing on cold stone walls, wearing inadequate armor, holding weapons you barely knew how to use, protecting people who wouldn't acknowledge your existence under normal circumstances. You ate terrible food, slept in overcrowded barracks, and endured weather that seemed specifically designed to make human life miserable. The pay was irregular and insufficient. The working conditions were dangerous and uncomfortable. The prospects for advancement were minimal. The chances of violent death were significant. The possibility of comfortable retirement was essentially non-existent. You lived in a rigid social hierarchy that reminded you daily of your low status. You had no legal protections, no workers' rights, no safety regulations, and no recourse when things went wrong. Your employers considered you a necessary expense rather than a valuable asset, and they treated you accordingly. The psychological toll of constant vigilance, social isolation, and moral conflict wore down even the strongest men. You were expected to kill and die for causes you might not understand, protecting wealth you'd never possess, serving masters who considered you barely human. And yet, thousands of men chose this life, not because it was appealing, but because their alternatives were even worse. Castle Guard service represented security and regular meals in a world where both were rare commodities. It offered purpose and identity to men who had been discarded by medieval society's economic and social systems. The guards who served in medieval castles were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were desperate men making the best of terrible situations, trying to survive in a world that offered few opportunities for advancement and fewer guarantees of basic security. Their service was motivated more by necessity than nobility, more by fear than courage. But perhaps that makes their sacrifice more meaningful rather than less. These men stood watch on dark walls, endured hardships that would break modern people, and faced death daily not for glory or recognition, but simply because someone had to do it. They were the invisible foundation upon which medieval civilization rested, the forgotten guardians whose vigilance allowed others to sleep safely. Their legacy isn't found in songs or statues, but in the simple fact that the castles they defended still stand today, weathered monuments to the men who gave their lives protecting them. Every stone wall, every tower, every gate they guarded represents thousands of hours of miserable duty performed by men whose names history has forgotten. So the next time you see a medieval castle, remember the guards who walked its walls. Remember the men who shivered through winter nights, sweated through summer days, and died defending places they never truly called home. They deserve to be remembered not as romantic figures from a distant past, but as real people who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage they could muster. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by kings and nobles, but by ordinary people who do extraordinary things under terrible conditions. The medieval castle guard was never celebrated, rarely remembered, and seldom thanked. But without him, the medieval world as we know it could not have existed. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. That civilization depends not on its most visible figures, but on its most forgotten ones. The guards who stand watch while others sleep. The men who hold the line while others argue about where it should be drawn. The medieval castle guard lived a life that sucked in almost every conceivable way, but his service, however reluctant and however unrewarded, helped shape the world we inherited. And for that, if nothing else, he deserves our respect.